Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. My name is Matthew Hall, and the title of today's episode is What Does the UN Do for Consumers? UNCTAD's Role in Promoting Competition and Consumer Protection. UNCTAD, or UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, is a permanent intergovernmental body established by the UN General Assembly in 1964, so some 60 years ago. It supports developing countries to access the globalized economy, working mainly with governments to help meet the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs are a collection of 17 global goals set by the UN General Assembly in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. UNCTAD currently has some 250 projects in around 70 countries. The UN General Assembly has entrusted UNCTAD to be the focal point within the UN on competition and consumer protection issues. The purpose of its policies in those areas is to contribute to poverty reduction and the achievement of the SDGs by improving the functioning of markets through strengthened competition and consumer protection. My co-host today is Alicia Downey. Alicia, would you like to introduce our guest and kick off the conversation, please?
It would be my pleasure, Matthew. Thank you. Teresa Moreira is the head of the Competition and Consumer Policies branch at UNCTAD. As such, she leads UNCTAD's work in the areas of competition and consumer protection. She joined UNCTAD in 2016, previously serving as the Consumer Director General of Portugal and as a member of the board of the Portuguese Competition Authority when it was first created. She has also served as Portugal's Director General and Deputy Director General for International Economic Relations and has held senior positions at the Directorate General for Competition. We're delighted to have Teresa as our guest today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So to just kick off, can you tell us a little bit more about UNCTAD generally, the functions and strategies of the Competition and Consumer Policies branch within it?
Yes, of course. So, as Matthew mentioned, we have the privilege of being the custodians of the only two internationally agreed instruments in both fields. So the first one is the short name is a UN set of principles and rules of competition, which of course is an ensemble of recommendations that were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1980. Interestingly, recognizing how competition law and policy can contribute to promote development. So, encouraging developing countries to adopt and implement competition law and policy, but recognizing, let's say, the legitimacy for their doing so according to their specific circumstances. We call that the development dimension. Of course, this is not to suggest that developing countries should enact a law that foresees or includes a number of exemptions for key sectors of the economy, but acknowledging that developing countries may need some time and go through transitional periods. So even though this is a non-binding instrument, this has clearly influenced the adoption of competition law and policy across the world. Nowadays, we have something like 140 countries having adopted a competition law and policy and setting up institutions to enforce the law, which I think shows the consensus that has spread. And quite frankly, in these turbulent times that we are living, I think it's quite gratifying to see that there are consensus about some of the most important public policies. The other instrument is the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection, also adopted by a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly in 1985, which are, again, a set of recommendations, but quite different because they cover a lot of very specific issues like framework for national consumer protection policies, but also specific issues such as consumer product safety, dispute resolution, sustainable consumption, and of course, both instruments really set up what we call a framework for international cooperation, conferring UNCTAD a key role in convening meetings and promoting exchanges of information, of knowledge, peer learning, and also, of course, providing technical assistance to those that are in need. So UNCTAD actually is focused on assisting developing countries in taking fully advantage, let's say, of the opportunities that are offered by the global economy. So even though our membership is very wide, 195 members, which of course includes all developed countries, we bring them together for these exchanges, trying to provide options for developing countries that should then identify what best serves their purposes, their goals, and then if they need our support, they come to us and we provide this technical cooperation.
So in referring to developing countries, is there a clear definition of what a developing country is for UNCTAD?
That is a very interesting question. Quite frankly, the wide developing country notion is connected with, I would say, three main factors. So, of course, a less developed economic structure of a country, initially related to the level of industrialization, for instance, of a country, which of course now seems a little bit outdated with the advent of the digital era. Also, let's say, a low level of education and basic care provided by the public infrastructures. I'm sure you are familiar with the Human Development Index, and so there are a combination of factors that are even concerning, for instance, health care being available, etc., or life expectancy. So it's a mix of issues, but mostly we tend to rely on the country's self-definition. This has been mostly used for the international trade multilateral system, for the World Trade Organization, where the World Trade Organization accepts that countries will define themselves or qualify themselves as developing countries, because then they can benefit from transitional periods for the full implementation of some commitments, this type of thing. And UNCTAD, of course, because it is based on international trade and development. Actually, we were rebranded this week. We're still UNCTAD, but the UN Trade and Development Body, because I think it conveys a more clear idea. So we tend to rely on countries for that. There are, of course, big discussions because when we talk about developing countries, it's a very heterogeneous group. You have the BRICS, for instance, now extended to the BRICS Plus, which includes Middle Eastern countries, some African countries, and at least one Latin American country as well. You have then a category of the, let's say, the less developed ones, which are the least developed countries. That is the only list that is, let's say, more clearly defined and reviewed every 3-5 years. And then you have other groups like landlocked developing countries or small island developing countries. So all of these categories recognize the differences, challenges and needs, which can be quite diverse. And as you can imagine, it's quite difficult sometimes to consider China as a developing country. At the same time, you cannot qualify, I don't know, an oil-producing country. Let me talk about a Portuguese-speaking country in Africa, Angola, and compare it to the Dominican Republic or to Tuvalu in the Pacific. So it's very different realities.
It is complex, isn't it?
Those countries must have a very wide range of differing viewpoints, and you must have to tailor your advice and discussions with them very carefully.
Absolutely. So what we have done, because as you rightly mentioned, we are celebrating this year our 60th anniversary, which is more than mature. It's like a senior stage.
60 is the new 40.
I know. I relate very much to that. But that means that, of course, we have done regularly stock taking of our experience, not just to assess its impact, but also to renew it, to broaden it, and to make sure that, as you said, what we do is tailor-made to our membership, especially, of course, the developing countries. So we have developed, let's say, two big products for technical cooperation. One is entitled Competition and Consumer Protection Frameworks, which encompasses drafting a new law, revising a new law, assisting in the drafting of implementing regulations, for instance, merger regulations that authorities need to put in place, but also providing comments on sector-specific regulatory legislation, and of course, enhancing the capacities of the competition or consumer protection agencies, but also raising awareness to other governmental bodies, to other key stakeholders like the judiciary, like sectoral regulator staff, like media, business associations, chambers of commerce. So we have this multi-stakeholder approach, which of course I think we all agree it's extremely important, because developing countries, apart from the very important achievement of having a law and an institution to enforce it, they really need to improve their competition and consumer protection culture. And this can only be done bringing together all stakeholders and throughout a continuous work. So we have technical cooperation projects that tend to be 3 to 4 years, but every X years we need to go back and see what else can be done. So this cannot be enough if it is like a standalone, very intense activity. It needs continuous discussions, and that's why we provide this forum for exchanges and meetings in person in Geneva and virtually.
Can we look a bit more in detail at what the CCPB is focused on? I see that there are 7 working groups. So could you just discuss a bit on what some of those would be doing?
Yes, absolutely. So that you understand, formally we convene annual intergovernmental group of experts meetings in Geneva. And when I joined, I started ages ago as a delegate, first on competition, then on consumer protection. It seemed very limited. So throughout the year, you meet once a year. This is absolutely insufficient, and we have so many member states. And of course, as in most conferences and meetings, at the end there are always usually the less experienced or a little bit shyer that come to you and say, oh, we did not really have time to ask comments, etc. So I've been noticing this, and I propose that we established informal working groups that even pre-pandemic were already meeting virtually, so meeting maybe 4 or 5 times per year, and discussing an agenda that, again, is agreed by member states and other stakeholders. So we started first with consumer protection actually brought a more lively discussion. We started with consumer product safety, consumer protection in e-commerce. And for instance, consumer protection in e-commerce, this year we already had 3 webinars to discuss artificial intelligence impacts, with the support of a friend and colleague, Professor Christine Riefer from a UK university. We have a recent group on consumer protection and gender, which has drawn a lot of attention from a number of developing countries, which we are very happy to see, starting in Latin America, but also in Africa. And on the competition side, currently we only have 1 working group on cross-border cartels. Now, you can tell me, oh, but that is such a classic topic. Yes, but believe it or not, it's still a very interesting topic, especially for the youngest and for the smallest authorities, because they have foreign investment in their country, they will have a number of global players, they hear in conferences and informal meetings about cartel a cartel case, I don't know, that Egypt is conducting, and just because they are in sub-Saharan Africa, that doesn't prevent them from being interested and seeing, but they are also active in our market. So I think this is still a very important issue. And the participants have opted for a different type of approach. Some of them actually present cases, concluded cases, the European Commission, other OECD member states like Chile. And that is extremely helpful. So what one could think that right now, with the maturity of competition law and policy internationally, there is no longer a need for this, that is not right. There are always new colleagues, experts that are very interested. What we do in these broad areas every year is discussed and agreed with participants, because we are within the United Nations Secretariat. We exist to serve member states, of course, as the Secretariat and as an expert, and my team also as experts. We are expected to provide suggestions to let's say, in a little bit facilitate the way, especially for those who are less knowledgeable. And of course, we also get very valuable contributions from the most advanced agencies. So we have, as you can imagine, in the UN, in order to interact better with member states, there are regional groups established. There is a very important group which is called G77 of developing countries, even though it represents probably 100 or something countries. And there used to be a Group B, which represented the OECD member states, and now that Group B includes, of course, the EU member states and what we could call, it's a lot of acronyms, JUSCANs, that is to say Japan, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and now the UK.
Those are some acronyms I personally haven't heard of. Can we look at some specifics in relation to developing countries? Just thinking that some of the issues that you have to deal with probably are looked at in a particular way in some of these countries. I'm thinking of the importance of compliance, even recognition of how important competition and consumer protection laws are, and also presumably, just as an example, a lot of these issues are very politicized, I imagine. So what would you see as some of the key differences or particularities of dealing with developing countries that you need to think about in your day-to-day work?
Well, I would...
Although, as we mentioned, there's a whole range of countries, so maybe it's difficult to be
But there is something
generic.
in common. Yes, absolutely. But there are points in common. I would say that we are privileged to be a member-driven organization, meaning that my team, of course, interacts with competition authorities and consumer protection agencies, but their member states, their governments, are the ones that ask us and to whom we report. This allows us a very special position in order to, let's say, mainstream, if I can put it like this, competition and consumer protection. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge, but also the most interesting challenge with developing countries. Because if you look around the world, you see this wide number of countries with competition laws, often with competition authorities. Okay, some may be a little bit resource constrained or young or not yet very experienced. And yet sometimes you have the impression that they are a little bit isolated or even challenged in their own markets and societies. Why? Because there's a lack of competition culture. And I think we as UNCTAD have this opportunity of reaching out to the government and supporting the work of the competition authority so that, for instance, we saw this clearly actually after the pandemic outbreak. And I think that was really a very difficult period for obvious reasons, but at the same time, it provided such a good opportunity because we encourage competition authorities to reach out to the government and offer opinions, advice on new legislation. You know, the economic recovery packages that, of course, had to be put in place, but several of them included so many subsidies, so many exceptional or favorable treatment of some sectors of some companies that there was a risk that this would be prolonged and really diminish competition to the detriment of consumers. And we saw, even in a number of developing countries, a lot of initiatives. So competition authorities and consumer protection agencies putting themselves out, if I may say so, and taking a really important advisory role. And what we observed was that advocacy was really on the rise. And I think that is extremely important. And this is where I think UNCTAD can really assist and encourage developing countries to improve, because, you know, there are a lot of other organizations, and look at the International Competition Network, where a number of competition authorities from developing countries are participating. And I think that is very encouraging and very positive. But how much of those learnings, which are fantastic because they have these trainings on merger assessment, on how to handle anti-competitive practices cases. So practical. I think this is unique. But how much of that then is easily translated to the market, to the society of these countries? And this is where we can intervene.
It's probably not that different. In fact, it strikes me from even not more sophisticated, but more established jurisdictions, and that there's always a need for advocacy. And just in my home jurisdiction, the CMA is always advocating, spends its whole time doing that. So there's an interesting parallel there.
You are right. Of course, advocacy is always important. But when you think that a lot of developing countries still have a number of state-owned companies, or they have privatization processes ongoing of key sectors of the economy, of course, that makes more sense. I would absolutely agree. And we know that in the Western world, competition advocacy in this role, and we also saw competition authorities of the most advanced jurisdictions having a much, let's say, louder voice since the pandemic outbreak. And I think that was very interesting, because that at the same time, that also allowed competition authorities to adjust a little bit their mandate and their range of actions to new challenges and become maybe, how can I put it, maybe more inclusive, between brackets, I would say.
So you've given us a wonderful sense of what UNCTAD and your branch does and has been doing in all of the various areas in which it works, and with all of the various stakeholders as you've described them. For those listening to this podcast, we're going to post a link on the web page for this episode to some of the branch's work product, including some recent white papers and reports that have been generated. So in addition to the conferences, you actually are producing materials that are useful for your members. Looking back over the last 5 years, though, what would you say has been the most significant or valuable work that the branch has done?
I think we have had a number of very interesting projects on emerging important issues. I would like to talk about one on developing consumer online dispute resolution for 2 member states where e-commerce thrives. And these are Thailand and Indonesia. This was funded by the China Silk Road Group. And it was very interesting for us to a point that a number of developing countries, even big ones like India, have been requesting us to propose a global online dispute resolution system, which of course is extremely ambitious, but it's aspirational and very interesting. This on that side. On the competition side, we did very interesting work throughout the pandemic, and we got back to, let's say, classic between brackets issues. For instance, challenges faced by micro and small and medium-sized companies in their markets, and their lack of understanding, their lack of knowledge of why competition matters and how a competitive market can provide them actually opportunities. So among other things, we developed an online course on competition policy for SMEs. That has been extremely popular. It's something that is being done at the own pace of the participants. We accept nominations from competition authorities. So I think these two products are interesting. We also have been developing some interactive tools. We have one ongoing, which is the World Consumer Protection Map, where we gather information from our membership on key issues. So I mentioned product safety, dispute resolution, but also sustainable consumption and issues like that. So I think it has been very interesting, and because of this year's anniversary, we are preparing research to acknowledge, to take what we have done. We have something in preparation on the UNCTAD competition after almost 43 years, with contributors from academia, from competition authorities, and this will be out soon because we want to celebrate this anniversary.
Well, that's great. We look forward to seeing it.
Indeed, those sound like wonderful projects, and we will post links on our website. Teresa, at this point in our program, we like to ask some more personal questions to get an understanding of you in a bit more detail. Alicia went through your broad resume at the beginning, but do you have any comments to maybe younger people who would like to think about your type of career path into UNCTAD and that type of work?
I think it's very encouraging to see how many young persons are so qualified nowadays on competition and consumer protection across the world, namely in developing countries. And every time I go to a developing countries conference event, always make time to speak to younger people. For instance, in universities, we also have a research partnership platform which gathers researchers and universities that are working in these areas. And I think that's very rewarding. And I think it is quite interesting to share what the UN is actually doing, because I am a European myself. And throughout my career, my country, Portugal, joined what is now the EU in 1986, which was when I joined civil service as a case handler of Director General for Competition. And for a country like Portugal, only 10 million people joining, being a EU member state, I think it's the most important achievement of my generation. And because, of course, the EU expanded, the EU entered into new areas of law, etc., the EU and being a EU member state absorbs us so much that we hardly have enough time or resources for other organizations. So, of course, the OECD is also very important. But, for instance, the UN, with its multiple organizations from health to labor to migrations to human rights, intellectual property, telecommunications, I think it's difficult even to grasp what this can offer. And so I've always taught part-time at the Faculty of Law in Lisbon, and I have agreed when I come back to do, let's say, a pitch for the UN and UNCTAD in particular. Even in developed countries, you can do that. I think it's very important. There are UN offices in all developing countries and in most developed countries. But again, I think the diversity of issues does not always allow those who are interested to reach out. And I get a lot of calls from friends, sons and daughters that are interested. Where can he look? What can she do? And I think this confirms that there's so much information out there, but not really something that it is easy to grasp. And I think it's very important.
Well, maybe more people listening to this episode will start calling you up with the same requests. Now, to get to know you a little bit more as a person, we're going to ask you something we ask all of our guests on our Curious Amalgam, and that is to tell us something interesting or unusual about yourself that is outside of your professional life.
Okay, I don't know if it is interesting, but I love music. I used to play guitar quite well when I was a teenager. I dropped that, but I'm dreaming of going back to that, and of singing, because I love singing. In my family, everybody has a ear for music. I don't think my voice is as powerful as it was in the past, but I'm thinking of joining a choir, and I'm obsessed with something that is a choir that performs. Actually, it has been in the US. It started in Australia. It's called Pub Choir. It's fantastic. And I think it's singing and music are such uplifting things that just to think about this, I feel immediately more energetic.
Oh, what sort of guitar, what genre do you play?
Oh, I learned to read music and everything, so that was a mix of pretty classical stuff. But just covering existing pop music, I think that's nice. I think it's well, again, it's a bit personal, but I think music was my first love, as a very old song title used to say.
Oh, that's very nice. And finally, to end the episode, we're going to play a little game we call The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for The Curious Hat!
And the rules are very simple. Matthew is going to draw a random question from a virtual hat and read you the question. So take it away, Matthew.
I am now finding the random question from the hat, and the question is, Teresa, what book are you reading right now, and would you recommend it?
That's actually quite difficult. I'm very keen on detective novels, quite frankly. I can tell you about two favorite authors of mine. One is South African. He's called Dion Meyer. And I love everything this man writes, because this is based, of course, in Cape Town and South Africa. And having been there, it's so exciting to see the references, and it's a very different atmosphere. And also, I like very much an American writer, Sarah Paretsky, who writes about V.I. Warshawski, who is a woman.
That's a long series, isn't it?
almost a senior detective, but also based in Chicago, which is a mythic place from, I think, the point of view of detectives and, action type of things.
Our listeners can look up those authors if they don't know them already, and it sounds great. Thank you, Teresa, very much for coming on. It's been an excellent discussion. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.